Welcome, Nathan Stilwell, Campaign and Communications Manager for My Death, My Decision.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome to Kevjet, the podcast.
I'm excited.
I am as well. I've been having a pre-conversation with so many people about this, with my excitement for this conversation, because I'm so passionate about it and people around me know I am. And there's very little people around me who aren't. So the debate is kind of give and take. It's more so with people that the general public, I guess, that would have a debate with me about it. And I can see both sides, but I think today we're here to sort of just set the record straight on what the bill looks like and the rules and regulations around it and the importance of it more than anything, I think. So first off, if you just want to explain your role with the organization.
Sure. So My Death, My Decision is a tiny grassroots organization. It's very much volunteer led and volunteer organized. There's one member of staff, which is me, and then three kind of officers who help out and do excellent work on everything from social media to checking the emails, cashing the checks, and those sorts of things. So a lot smaller than people would think. And that means my role is everything from, chatting to politicians and, sitting them down and trying to convince a politician to change the law and support the law, to the next day, I might have an in-depth conversation with someone who's taken the person they love to Dignitas in Switzerland for an assisted death, or someone who didn't have that option and, they would like that option, or someone whose mum, dad, brother or sister had a terrible death in the UK and they want to change the law that way. So it's very, very broad and it has to be very, very broad because it needs to bring all of these voices and kind of, I think a core part of my role actually is just trying to kind of amplify different voices and different kind of human beings who have experienced something and that's made them want to try and change this law.
What has made you so passionate about the cause?
To be perfectly honest, it's just something that I fundamentally believe in. It feels like a common sense argument to me. It's something that I remember seeing this kind of job application come up, and I was with my parents at the time. Like I was literally looking at my phone, sat around the kitchen table talking to my parents. I said to my parents, "This job's come up, and it's about trying to change the law on assisted dying. And how do you feel about it?" And it's the first time I'd spoken to my parents about something like that, and they were so mind-blowingly supportive. They actively said, "You should definitely go for that." And then obviously I spoke to my grandparents, my aunts and uncles about this, the older generation. And again, their support was a lot more enthusiastic than I ever imagined. And so it was something that I believe in. It's something that I would want for myself. And then the moment I got involved, kind of the passion just grew and grew and grew. The moment I had the first conversation with a terminally ill person, it's hard to come back from that. It's hard to come back from someone who's suffering and wants that choice and then to say, actually, I don't believe in this. So yeah, I almost fell into this. It was never intentional. And now it's something that I've campaigned on for years and I fundamentally want to see the law change.
It's such an important cause and I applaud you 100%. And I'm backing you 100% as well. I have worked in palliative care for many, many years, and I can tell you that there's no such thing as a Hollywood death. People think that you close your eyes and that's the end, but the reality is not that. And I wish that people that were making these laws would experience some of the real life events and didn't just fall back on whatever their personal beliefs are if they haven't experienced that with a loved one. I always jump back to, we would never let our pets suffer. So why do we let our parents or loved ones, children, why do we let them suffer? And again, we go back to, and we'll talk about this. We're not saying that everybody has to do this. We're saying that everyone should have the option. It should be available. And do you want to explain maybe how this bill would work?
Yeah. If we can go into kind of the nitty gritty and maybe a little bit kind of almost, I don't want to say boring, but kind of the kind of political science around it, essentially. So suicide used to be illegal in the UK. And in the 60s, politicians decided rightly that was wrong. It was wrong to criminalize someone and put their family through trauma if they tried to or died by suicide. So in the suicide stopped being a crime. They changed the law there. And actually, a lot of people still say commit suicide. Mm-hmm. And that's a very outdated term because you can't commit something that's not a crime. So that's a term that's important kind of use in our language. But when they changed that law, they criminalized assisting or encouraging a suicide. And you can imagine from their perspective that felt like the right thing to do. And of course, encouraging a suicide should be, and is a heinous crime. But it's that assisting a suicide that's criminalized in the UK, and that's what's caused the issue here in the UK. In the sense that if you assist someone to die by suicide, you can face up to 14 years in prison for that assistance, and that assistance isn't legally defined. So, is driving someone to a doctor's appointment if they were to get an assessment to go to Switzerland, is that assisting? If someone asks me, which does happen, how can I have an assisted death? If I tell them simply to Google it, or here's a pamphlet, would I be assisting them? Arguably, yes. Arguably, yes, I'd be breaking the law there. And so that's where we've got into this kind of really legal kind of higgledy-piggledy nastiness, is this idea of what is assisting and why is it against the law? And so there's been a bill that's been put forwards, and it's a lot more complicated than this, but in its essence, what it's doing is it's carving out a little caveat to that assisting and saying, if you assist through this route of following these steps, then you're not breaking the law. And that's what the bill is trying to do.
And some of those, I guess, rules and regulations around it are, so the top one is you have to be dying within 6 months.
Yeah.
And you have to be mentally stable.
Yeah, so there's quite a few kind of steps that you have to take and criteria that you have to meet. So you have to have a terminal illness that cannot be alleviated by treatment. You must have discussed with the doctor all palliative care options, all different treatment options, and then you must have 6 months left to live or fewer, be 18 years old, be mentally competent throughout. So that means from the first conversation you have with a doctor where you say, clear that you understand what we're talking about, so you understand the implications, it's very clear that you want to go down this route. And then in addition to that, now as well, you'll have to have 2 independent doctors say that you meet their criteria, that nothing can be done to alleviates the condition and the illness that you have. There are waiting periods. So after the first assessment, you have a 7-day waiting period. After the second assessment, you have a 14-day waiting period. And then at the very end of this process, there's a panel which consists of a psychiatrist, social worker, and a lawyer that has to review the entire case. That panel can call to speak to the doctors. They can call to speak to you. And then after all of that approval process, which is quite lengthy, to be honest, then the person can be prescribed end-of-life medication, which they would have to take themselves. So a doctor can't administer, a doctor can't end someone's life. It has to be very much them taking the final step.
And where would this take place for the patient?
So that's actually one of the things that's being discussed at the moment. We as an organization are very clear that it should take place where the patient wants it to take place. For the majority of people abroad, that's their home. And that's where they want to be. Then a lot of people after that, there's people who have assisted death in hospital or in a care home or in a setting of their choice. And I think that's quite important, really. Like the whole fundamental idea behind this is giving someone dignity and choice. And so we think they should have that dignity and choice at the very end of their lives. But that's not to say that might not change. So the bill is still going through Parliament and changes can still be made. And there are some politicians who do want to restrict where this can happen. But that's one of the many things that we're campaigning against. Whilst we're campaigning for a change in the law, we're trying to make sure that it's accessible and not too difficult and put someone's choice and autonomy and compassion and dignity at the very forefront.
Do you think we would ever see this happening in hospices? I
think so. And I think that's because for a lot of people, this might be where they spent the final 6 months of their lives, and they might want that. We've definitely seen some pushback, especially from religious hospices around this. And that's something that we have to navigate there. And there's also, for some hospices, someone might go into a hospice and then for the final weeks come out and go back to their home and things like that. So it's very complicated. But what's really important, I think, again, is that the person can have that choice of where they want to die and have it in an area, in a place that they feel is their home and they feel is comfortable and where they want it. And if that's a hospice, then I think that's the right thing for them. I think if they've had excellent care at that hospice and they've been treated with respect and dignity, then they should be able to die with dignity in that same place.
And we talk a lot about choice. And so it should be a choice that every living human should have, especially at the end of their life. But it is a choice. So if they apply for this to work, they also have the choice to not go through with it, don't they?
Absolutely. And if you look at kind of the bill as it's set out right now, they are asked over and over and over again if this is their choice. A person can't start the entire process without a written and witnessed declaration saying that they want to go down this route. And that's the same in most jurisdictions, to be honest. It's the same in Canada. You can't go down this route unless it's ultra crystal clear that you want to go through it. And another really important thing on that is you can stop at any time. And again, we know that internationally, lots of people do start this process and they do say, this is something that I want for myself. And then they might naturally change their mind. They might actually not die in pain and suffering, and they might have a good, quite natural death, and they feel that they don't need it. For a lot of people, I think what they do is they apply as a backup, as a, okay, I've got this terminal illness. If my pain and suffering gets so much that I can't talk to my family and I can't, I'm traumatizing them by screaming throughout the night or having this kind of painful death. If it comes to that, then I have this option. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down this route, get all the boxes ticked, make sure that I have this option, and then I'll only use it if my quality of life gets to a point where I'm the one that decides this isn't good enough.
That's right. The other point that I'd like to talk about is having control, because when you become diagnosed as being terminal, you lose control of everything. So as time goes on, you become a patient in a hospital bed or in your bed at home. You depend on everybody to look after you. You have no control over anything. This gives that person some control, and they can have that time with their loved ones. They can spend time with the people they want to. They have a time frame in their mind. They know what they can deal with, what they can't. And I just find it unbelievable that in 2025, we have people that will deny that from somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of like these social issues, we will look back and say what took us so long, and that's if the law changes at all. That there is still a strong chance that law doesn't change. There's still a massive campaign that we're running just to make sure that it does pass. And again, compared to a lot of countries, the UK is going down quite a narrow, quite a strict, and quite a specific law compared to countries that have gone for something more liberal and more broad. And again, it does come down to this kind of control aspect. And I spoke to a Canadian doctor, Dr. Stephanie Green, who's excellent on this. And she said that before assisted dying was legalized, that, a doctor's role was often saying no to patients. No, you can't have this. No, this is going to happen. I'm afraid you don't have a choice. This is what's going to be. And she said what was so strange about being an assisted dying campaigner and an assisted dying practitioner was that she gets to say yes. The patient says, I want this. I want to die in this location. I want it to be on this date. I want this choice. And for the first time in her medical career, she was like, yes, absolutely. If that's what you want, then as long as you meet this criteria, then yes, you can go down that route. And I think that control, I think we should be giving that control to people who are dying. I think that's so important that they get that choice and they get that feeling that for once they're in control, not the cancer or the motor neuron disease or the illness that they've got.
100%. I find myself watching documentaries or debates and I'm shouting at the television because I'm just thinking the people that are so opposed to it probably have never spent any time in a palliative care setting, or they're just going by what they read in books, or they haven't volunteered into a hospice. They haven't spent time with someone who's actually dying a really painful death. And palliative care is a wonderful thing, but it doesn't always work.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we found in the UK, a lot of the opposition to this has been very much it's from religious institutions, from organized religious groups and lobbyists and lobby groups there. And that's where the core crux and the funding and the real opposition has come from. And I think, again, that there's a fundamental belief they have of the kind of sanctity of life and of of God being the person or God being the one that takes life and gives life, and that human beings can't. But that just seems to be at odds with modern way of life, where modern medicine can give life and modern medicine can do so much. And again, we have so much choice and autonomy now. It feels very outdated to say to a person, you're forced to suffer because of my beliefs and what I think there. And again, I respect every religious person who doesn't want this. And In fact, that there are some politicians that I really respect because they've said, I'm very religious, I'm very against this, but I'm going to vote for it because it's what the people want and it's because that's where the evidence is leading. And that's who I think are very strong people I have the utmost respect for. But there definitely has been this organized, well-funded religious lobby that's trying to stop the change in the law.
It would be interesting to ask those people in general if they have pets, for example, and what they would do if their pet was suffering. Because in this day and age, that's what we do. We would never let our pet suffer. And I believe that we should never let our loved ones suffer. What would your argument be with someone who comes up to you, someone from that organization comes up to you in their defense and they're like, look, we're totally against it because of religion. So how can you prove me wrong?
I think it's kind of impossible to prove them wrong in that point. I did a talk just to, a really local group, in the back room of a pub. There was kind of 20, 30 people there the other day. And when I finished my talk, one of the guys stood up and said, "So I'm a local priest in the local church." And my heart sank. I was like, "Oh, this is going to get more antagonistic." And he said, I've done a full 180 in this. I completely believe in it. It's really made me think about my faith and think about that. And there's different ways of approaching it with faith. But the first is that actually that there's nothing necessary. If you look at it from different kind of religious angles, if you look at it from a Christian angle, there's nothing necessarily in the Bible that forbids this. There is kind of the thou shalt not kill, but that's to extrapolate that to yourself is a bit different. And there's actually suicides in the Bible, and there's different interpretations of those suicides as well. And then in Islam and for many Muslims, again, it's this idea that God is the only one that can give and take away life. I think the argument there would be around what's your definition of life. If someone is able to speak and move and be independent and interact with their family members and do things that they love and everything like that, and that they are doing what they feel to be a fulfilling life, then absolutely. But then if someone is terminally ill, they can't interact with their family. They're in so much pain and suffering that they I had one man explain to me that his wife was either in so much pain that she couldn't talk, or was on so much pain medication that she couldn't talk. And it's just I couldn't imagine putting the person that I hate the most in the world through that, let alone watching the person that I love the most go through that. It feels totally perverse in that sense. So fundamentally, I think changing hearts and minds goes from personal stories, goes from real life stories, and asking someone if they could look at a terminally ill person and say, should that person be suffering?
I think it's wonderful to hear from the voices of people that are terminally ill and to have their stories heard at this point, because fundamentally that's your answer right there. And I think, do you have statistics on the percentage of terminally ill people that would prefer to have control over their death?
I think what we have kind of two things that we can use on this. We have public opinion polling, which has been overly consistently, overwhelmingly supportive for decades, for the longest time. Of terminally ill people, I'm not sure if there's actually specific kind of surveys of them, and I think that's something that's maybe missing out of this debate, is their voices are often overlooked. But what we do have is we have the Office of Health Economics in the UK looked at the kind of end of life experiences of dying people, and 20 people a day are dying in some form of pain and suffering that cannot be relieved by palliative care or drugs or anything. That's still a small percentage of those who die every day. We don't want to fearmonger. The majority of people will hopefully have natural, peaceful deaths without much pain and suffering. And modern palliative care is so much better than it was about relieving pain and suffering. But for some people, it doesn't work. And that's as much as 20 people a day are dying in pain. Yeah, again, to really put this point out, not all of those 20 people a day would choose an assisted death. Some people don't want it, but for those people, dying people, especially those who are dying in pain and suffering, they should have that option. They should have that choice.
Speaking of 1 in 20, I believe Canada is 1 in 21 deaths are medically assisted at the moment, which is amazing.
Yeah, that correlation's really there. It's funny as well because opponents in the UK will point to Canada a lot and say, look, that they throw that literal statistic out as a reason not to have assisted dying. Go, look, 1 in 21 people are having assisted death in Canada. That's awful. Like, how can you imagine that? And I go, well, yeah, that is awful, because look at the UK. if we apply those Canadian rates to the UK, how many people would have wanted and would have chosen an assisted death who don't have that choice? How many of their loved ones are being criminalized for helping them? How many of them are wanting to flee abroad to go to countries which do have this compassionate choice? It feels quite, I get passionate about this because it feels so perversely wrong.
Is it one a day for Brits that flee the country for
Yeah.
assisted suicide, which is unbelievable?
Yeah, and again, Switzerland is very much used as kind of a wink and a nudge. You know, you're going to Switzerland for an assisted death. It's kind of anecdotal at this point, but it is as much as I don't know if it's as much as one a day. I think it's as much as one a week goes to Switzerland now. There are other countries that people do go to as well. But what we've seen and figures were announced just the other week is that UK membership of Dignitas, so it's a kind of a membership organization, has soared. It's through the roof. Hundreds of people are signing up to this, again, fearing that if the end of their life is so painful and suffering that they have their option. But it's not an option actually for a lot of people. It costs a lot, especially for a terminally ill person, to fly abroad. I've heard stories of private ambulances, private jets even, get the person abroad. And even then, it's only for someone who's physically able. And for a lot of people, getting out of bed and going to the loo might be too difficult at the very end of their lives, let alone going to a different country. And sorry to hammer this home, but I work quite closely with a lot of people who have accompanied loved ones to Switzerland for an assisted death. And it always just fills me with these conflicting emotions, because for one of the stories are always very similar. You know, that the person had a dignified death. You know, that they had a laugh at the end. They ate some chocolate. They drank some champagne. They held the hand of the person they loved. They took the end of life medication, and they fell asleep, and then they died. And it's peaceful and dignified. And I think, wow, aren't you lucky that you had that choice and that option, and you have that kind of nice final memory of your loved one. And then that emotion is at the same time of, kind of anger and disgust, like that. You were forced abroad. You were forced away from your home. And more than that, you're now going to be treated like a criminal, and your friends and family could not be there with you because they were going to be made criminals if they joined you. And that feels disgusting. That feels horrible that we could do that to British citizens, that we could do that to our own people, force them abroad for this option.
So many stories from people back home in Canada, and they've taken control. They've been terminally ill. They've had wakes with their friends and family before their deaths. They were present. They heard the beautiful stories. They shared the memories. They drank the champagne. That's such a special gift, not just for them, but to offer their friends and family.
Yeah. And in Parliament recently, there was a committee kind of looking at the bill, and they got evidence from kind of people around the world who had this, from British citizens, interesting enough. And it was so stark because there was one story about a man whose loved one had died of motor neuron disease in the UK. And the story was horrifying. It was painful. It was just not what anybody would have wanted. And then it went to the next person, and she was a British resident in Spain, and her husband had an assisted death in Spain. And she says he was a cowboy and he loved everything cowboy, and he died with his cowboy boots on. He insisted. He said, "That's how I want to die." And he held her hand and took, the end of life medication, and was there joking until the very last moment.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't a dry eye in the room. It was so unbelievably powerful, because how could you have those two at the same time? How could you have one British man dying in such horrendous circumstances, and another British man who had the fortune and opportunity to live abroad, dying on his own terms, giving his wife a lovely send? I mean, his wife there's still grief and trauma from someone dying. Of course there is. But the difference between the two surviving family members, one who'd watched someone suffer and one who'd watched someone had a dignified death, was outstanding. You couldn't describe it. And it was such a pivotal, I think, moment in the campaign, because it really showed why this is so important.
What would you say to somebody who says, well, if we pass this bill in the UK, it's a slippery slope to what could happen?
Yeah. I mean, that's been thrown at us from multiple different angles. And it's almost kind of, it's hard not to be flippant about it. The same argument was used when we legalized homosexuality. It's a slippery slope. The same argument was used with abortion. It's a slippery slope. And in the end, actually, partially, to be honest, they were correct. Like when we decriminalized homosexuality, we made the age of consent to be 21. We put inequalities into the law even when we made it more equal. And then that changed to 18, and then that changed to the same age of consent. And so if you're sliding towards more compassion, like, good, like, that's what's really hard to kind of push back at this argument. But on the other side, what we've seen actually is countries, Switzerland changed their law in the 1940s, and they've had pretty much, look, their law is the same as it was in the 1940s. Oregon changed their law in 1997, I believe it was. So again, decades ago now. And their law, the people who are eligible, it's still 6 months, people who have 6 months left to live or fewer. And that's been the same for over 25 years in Oregon. So there is also a chance that wherever the law lands in the UK, it will stay like that forever. And that's why it's so important to get the law right the first time around and get it stuck there. But yeah, it's a question that's thrown at us constantly, and it's really hard to kind of remain level-headed with it, because again, like, I might have just spent that morning talking to a terminally ill person, and then someone says, what about the slippery slope? And I say, if you were speaking to a terminally ill person, you wouldn't say that. And if you did say that, they'd probably swear pretty much loudly, back at you.
Exactly. I can imagine that the conversation gets pretty heated at times when you're out there campaigning. Are there any times that stand out in your mind just offhand?
So it was so funny. When I started this job, in the public, I thought I would have a lot more controversy than I have. I thought I'd go on a date, and they'd ask me what I did, and then I'd have a drink thrown in my face, or, I'd be on a taxi, and literally yesterday, I was in a taxi with big signs saying "My death, my decision," because I'd just come back from Parliament. And I'm like, am I going to get kicked out? Like, what's going to happen? And I've genuinely, and I'm not saying this because I'm a campaigner or anything like that, I genuinely, with a member of the public, have not had a negative conversation about this ever. I've had conversations where people are on the fence, and I've had conversations where people disagree respectfully, but I've never had this kind of fever controversy that I thought it was, and I thought I would get. I have had, the odd email like "F you murderer" and the odd phone call saying, what's wrong with society, and that's fine. People can share their views in a free country as they want. But that in Parliament, again, it's remained pretty respectful, but it has been, I think, the debate has heated up in that sense. And while we're not maybe seeing nasty words going around, we're maybe seeing kind of nastier tactics or people trying to kind of distort what other people have said and that sort of thing. So that there's definitely, I think the more it's spoken about, the more there's a heated. Just quickly, weirdly enough as well, so my flatmate's from New Zealand, she's a Kiwi. And in New Zealand, the law changed by referendum. So a really big public national debate. And I was asking her about it, and she said, yeah, it was so heated. It was so much, it really hit a fever pitch. In fact, the kind of anti-assisted dying people ran a TV campaign with like actors trying to steal money from their granny and granddad, really, it got really gross, and it did get really heated. And then she said the law passed, the referendum was in favor by a massive majority. And then the debate disappeared overnight. And it's just, again, now already it's a very accepted part of New Zealand's end of life care, is that you have that choice, you have that option. And already I think they're looking back at their debate going, wow, if it wasn't so heated, we probably could have made this a bit better for the terminally ill person, and we could have changed that safeguard that actually is more of a barrier at the moment than a safeguard on these things. So the debate does heat up, and it does how hot the debate is will change what law we end up with.
Do you feel that the timeline between the moment that you apply and the moment that you're accepted is too long?
Yes, I do. I think that there's a caveat in this bill which is welcome, which is if the person's death is imminent, the waiting periods can be waived. That's quite reassuring because one of the people that I speak to, the families that I speak to, was a man called Dan Tuckley. And he got diagnosed with a very, very aggressive form of cancer. And his timeline from diagnosis to death was 2 months, I think, less. That's really not a long time. And also another thing that we as an organization keep saying is the person going through this by definition is dying. You don't want them to be going to unnecessary doctor's appointments and assessments. And you don't want it to be a trial, right? You don't want it to be adversarial. You want it to be a peaceful process that they can go down that has the checks and balances, but isn't too difficult. And I am worried that what we might see when if the law passes, is people who want this assisted death and choose it and go down that path and then die in pain and in suffering when they're on the path because they weren't able to get through it quick enough. And I think that's kind of the worst of all worlds, right? Is someone who clearly wants this and chose this, but doesn't get to access this because of the time frames. So I think that's been again, this has been so difficult because our role as an organization is, yes, to get this across the line. Absolutely, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we have to wholeheartedly support getting this across the line. But hopefully we've been the voice there being like, think of the terminally ill person, think of the dying person. When you're going through this, like it might seem like a nice safety measure to add this check and add that check. But at the end of the day, you're going to be forcing someone with a terminal cancer with months, maybe even weeks left to live, to go through that.
Do you think, in your opinion, is there anybody out there that should feel threatened by this bill?
No, I mean, the guidelines have been pretty clear. And in fact, what the bill, what it does is it adds a new offence for coercion. So anybody pushing anyone towards this, if they push someone towards making an assessment, that person can then get 14 years in prison. But if they force them into having an assisted death, which is unheard of, it's worth saying, internationally, we've not heard of this, but if that were to happen, they would face life in prison. We changed it to the equivalency of murder. It's really, really strong. And then if you look at the bill itself, it is so clear who this is for. And it even specifically says in the bill, you're not automatically terminally ill by the fact of having a disability or by having a mental health condition. It's very, very clear who this bill is for. On that, again, like one of the things, it's interesting speaking to a Canadian, right? Because the way that we approach this as Brits is as if we were the first people to ever have this conversation. Mm-hmm. Like we're world changers, we're game changers. And in Parliament, it happens all the time. It's all of these what ifs and what about that? And if the question is, what if someone who shouldn't, meet the criteria has an assisted death, what happens then? Well, we're in the fortunate position where we can open up Australia's most recent statistics and say, did anybody not meet the criteria? No. We can open up New Zealand's most recent statistics. We can open up Canada's. We can open up California's, Oregon's, Switzerland's. And it's not happened. We haven't seen people who don't meet the criteria have an assisted death in this way. So we're fortunate in that, and I really hope we learn from that.
You can imagine how frustrating it is for somebody who has a healthcare background from Canada who's living in the UK, especially in palliative care.
Yeah, this will be interesting if you've got Canadian listeners and British listeners, because for British listeners, at least in politics, for people who are following this debate, Canada has been made out to be the bogeyman. That Canada is the most awful country in the world because your law is not restricted to the terminally ill. You can have an assisted death in Canada if you have a grievous medical condition that's, again, treatment. You can't, there's nothing that can alleviate the treatment. There's nothing that can be done. You have to have all of these assessments. If you, for example, have a condition like multiple sclerosis, so multiple sclerosis is not a terminal condition. It doesn't cause death in that linear way, but it can cause suffering. It can cause suffering for years and decades. Mm-hmm. That person can have an assisted death in Canada, whereas that person would not be able to have an assisted death in the UK. But for now in the UK, we are wholeheartedly focused on getting this bill, which is for terminally ill people, across the line. It's fundamental that terminally ill people have this choice.
It's so important, and it's like a no-brainer for anybody, I feel, that works in healthcare, especially palliative care. I would love to speak to somebody who would disagree working in palliative care.
I think you should, to be honest, because what's so interesting as well is the debate is framed in the UK as if palliative care was against assisted dying, and as if geriatric care and end-of-life care was against assisted dying. And that's what's thrown at politicians all the time, is palliative care is against this and hospices are against this. That's genuinely the argument put forward, that the people closest to death don't want this. And I think that's not the case.
It isn't the case. And palliative care is a wonderful thing. And when it works well, but it doesn't work well most of the time.
Yeah.
Because no two humans are exactly the same, and no deaths are going to be exactly the same. And so medication's not always going to work. And some people there's just so much to talk about around how somebody's death could occur, but somebody should always have the option to not suffer.
Yeah. And what's your experience been of that? Have you watched people suffer at the end of their lives, even if they've had the best care?
Yeah. I've held the hand of hundreds of patients who passed away, maybe even more. And the percentage of that, of people who would have passed away peacefully They've all been medicated and the last few days not aware of their surroundings, which people don't want to feel the pain, but they want to be aware, if that makes sense. So they're not able to make decisions at that point. I've had patients whose family members at that stage say, you know what, I really don't want my loved one to have medication at this point because I don't want them to go quicker. And so you have that sort of debate on, well, it's going to go by what your loved one has asked for and wished for. So there's a lot of different things, and we can talk about a lot of different scenarios. But personally, as a palliative care professional, I opt for the assisted dying bill. 100%. And I think everybody that I've ever worked with would say the same thing. It's not Hollywood. And I keep trying to tell people that. It's not a Hollywood death. It's not like this beautiful romantic thing where you lay down with your head on the pillow and close your eyes. That's not how it works. And if it does work that way for somebody, that is a blessing. But that's not how it works every day.
Yeah. I think we've found palliative care kind of specialists in the UK really afraid that people would, if assisted death is legalized, that people would stop going to hospices, or they'd view them as kind of places to die rather than places to alleviate their suffering.
They are a beautiful thing. A hospice is a beautiful thing. And that option is beautiful if that's what works for the patient and the family.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're trying to explain to politicians at the moment as well is that, you can't say ideal because that's the wrong word, but for a lot of people who go down this assisted dying route, they'll have palliative care, right? So they'll be surrounded by their loved ones. They'll have very, very good care. And then they get to a point where the care doesn't meet what their quality of life, what they want it to be like. But we've also had to explain to politicians, especially when it comes to family, that not all people have that relationship with their family. And as much as we, in the bill and in the guidelines and everything like that, we can put in things about, please talk to your family about this and please make sure they're on board. There are going to be some family members who are going to disagree with your choice. And again, that's what we've seen the most internationally is not people pushing someone towards an assisted death. In fact, that's almost unheard of. That is unheard of. What we've heard of is the opposite, as a family member's not ready to let go, or they have a religious opposition to assisted dying and they don't believe in it. And they try and they do everything in their power to block that individual from having an assisted death, and they campaign against it. So we've had to try to make politicians cautious of, put in a role for family members, but it can't be mandatory. It can't be, that a person must be able to say, I don't want my family anywhere near this. I don't want them to know what's happening.
Exactly. Right. I totally agree with that. And for anybody that says palliative care works great in this country, or, well, I can only speak for this country at this point in time, but speak to a palliative care nurse who works in the community, who has many, many patients who are on palliative care in their own homes and they're overworked. Speak to those staff members and get their opinions or follow them for a day and just see what the real world looks like, especially the hospice at home, which is a great program when it works properly, but it's not always foolproof. So there's so many different aspects to this conversation. And I just wish that people making the decisions would spend some more time in the real world.
To not defend them, this is not playing devil's advocate, but politicians have been kind of bombarded with information. It's almost a bit saturated now. So I do feel for many politicians who are on the fence about this and that the lobby against this have been very, very well funded, well paid, organized. And it's been kind of people who have been around the block. So some of the core campaigners have been the Society for Protection of Unborn Children, the abortion campaigners, or Christian Action Research, again, fundamentalist Christian campaigners there. And so they've been the ones kind of bombarding information and trying to distort the facts and trying to make things a bit more difficult. And so for a politician, if you are on the fence and if you don't know about it, it is genuinely hard to get that cut through, right? To get to understand that meaning. And that's why organizations like My Death, My Decision are so important. It's because we need to try and get this information in front of politicians. And weirdly for us, often it's not information necessarily that we're trying to get in front of politicians, it's people. We're trying to get every politician to meet with a terminally ill person, to hear that from the terminally ill person, to hear their perspective. And so when a politician is being bombarded with, the rates in Canada, they're growing exponentially and it's a massive slippery slope. And look over there in Belgium, it's all awful and everything like that. We're trying to cut through that noise and say, listen to a woman called Claire who doesn't want her daughters to watch her suffer. Listen to this man called Tim, who's lived a great life, but he's really, really worried now that his cancer is going to cause him so much suffering. Listen to this man called Dave. He took his wife to Switzerland, and it was again, as we described, a beautiful experience and a heartfelt experience and a loving experience. But it was abroad and it was painful, and he was criminalized when he came back to the UK. And that's what our role as an organization is. And as I said, we're tiny, we're really small. This is a David and Goliath moment, interestingly enough. And we've really had to work so hard to get those messages across the line.
It's amazing. I just can't commend you enough for the work you're doing.
Thanks. It's not been easy. This has probably been the most difficult thing that I've ever done in my life and probably ever will do. But again, like the moment it feels tough, like I think you'll probably have this experience, is even though I've worked on this for years now, there's a preconceived notion of what a terminally ill person will be like. So I took a terminally ill woman called Claire into Parliament a couple of months ago to talk to politicians. And again, I feel pretty bad about this. Like, my idea of her, she had stage 4 breast cancer, she didn't have long, was how am I going to support this person up the stairs, get them to Parliament, everything like that. And then I met her outside Parliament, and I was met with this cheery, bright, fiery woman. And her first question to me was, "Can I swear in Parliament?" And I'm there kind of taken back. Then like, right, okay, I've got to switch my mentality here, because this terminally ill person is the campaigner, right? She is fearful. She is fearful. She's fierce. She's pushing this through. And I had this notion that she would be timid, and I think you surely in palliative care, you come across that a lot of times, with preconceived notions of what dying people are going to be like.
Of course. And no two people are the same.
No, never. Whenever I speak to someone like Claire, it's very easy to get up in the morning and campaign hard, because you know why you're doing it, and you know who you're doing it for. I think that's quite a privilege to have in my position, actually. As difficult as it is, it's a very privileged role, and I'm very fortunate to be able to work in this role.
I've always said that every patient that I've ever been with who's passed away has given me a gift. That's been a gift that they've allowed me to be in that room at that time. That's such a beautiful experience. And so to do it in a controlled way, at their own wish, is just such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been a good conversation.
It has. I look forward to following this, and I'm going to keep everybody updated on this. And I'm looking forward to feedback from all the different countries in the world that are listening, because I'm sure everybody has different opinions and stories. So please send them in.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot.